Hello, this is Max. A businessman unexpectedly finds himself in an outdoor prison cell, accompanied only by an ancient grist mill. Compelled to labor like an animal, he must devise a plan to break free. Don't forget to subscribe. The opening scene introduces Joe, a corporate middle manager who wakes up in a mysterious, prison-like structure with no recollection of how he got there. He's surrounded by towering walls, a heavy metal door, and a massive stone mill at the center. Joe desperately searches for his missing phone but finds nothing. Confused and alarmed, Joe starts shouting for help, leading to an interaction with a neighboring cellmate who explains that Joe is something and because of the side effects, he will become depressed. He advises Joe to rest because the next day will be challenging. Joe receives basic food and water from a guard and he pleads to be released, citing his pregnant wife. However, the guard ignores his pleas and hurts his hand by closing the slot abruptly. Joe bandages his hand with his tie and reluctantly consumes the provided food. Later, an AI voice welcomes Joe to advanced career training and causes even more confusion. Joe turns to his cellmate for information, learning that this situation is connected to Mallard, the company where Joe works. Employees with declining performance end up in this prison-like setting. In the morning, Joe receives instructions on waste disposal and stumbles upon a human skull buried in the ground, raising concerns about deaths in this place. His cellmate explains that many employees have died, and they all signed contracts with stipulations they didn't thoroughly read. The AI voice instructs Joe about his new job, pushing the stone mill from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. to earn points. He must achieve a daily quota of 50 revolutions or face punishment. The employee with the lowest points will be terminated, regardless of meeting the quota. Joe pleads with the AI voice to let him go home, but the cellmate explains that the company keeps them as long as they need. Joe begins his grueling work, struggling to meet the daily quota of 50 revolutions, which requires immense strength. Despite the challenge, he manages to complete 100 revolutions by day's end. Exhausted, he falls asleep but is awakened by the cries of a fellow employee who is about to be killed. The following morning, Joe questions the purpose of the quota when employees are terminated even if they meet it. His cellmate explains that Mallard demands perfection and that good enough isn't sufficient for the company. As Joe and his neighbor converse, the neighbor advises Joe not to push himself too hard, cautioning that if he does, Mallard will raise its expectations. However, Joe believes that his hard work will be his path to freedom and a reunion with his pregnant wife. While working, Joe reflects on the day he surprised his wife, Kate, with their new house. She was concerned about the cost, but he managed to reassure her. The following day, Kate reminded him of a doctor's appointment and requested that he take a day off. But Joe hesitated, causing her distress. She expressed her dissatisfaction with his prioritization of work over family. Joe is brought back to the present when an alarm sounds, realizing that he has completed 150 revolutions. After his shift, a guard summons Joe to the door and orders him to undress. Fearful that he is about to be terminated, Joe points out his achievement of 150 revolutions, but the guard doesn't acknowledge it. The door opens, and Joe is taken to a dimly lit area where he is drenched with water, much to his relief. It turns out that this unexpected ordeal is simply a bath. As the days go by, Joe continues to work tirelessly under the scorching sun. The extreme heat forces him to consume more water, depleting his water bottle. Desperation sets in as Joe attempts to signal the guard for more water, but his neighbor informs him that they only receive enough food and water to keep them alive. The neighbor suggests a way for Joe to quench his thirst by urinating in bottles, filtering it through the insoles of his shoes, and storing it behind a pillar as a reserve. However, Joe finds this idea repulsive and refuses to consider it. Despite his exhaustion, Joe continues to work tirelessly, his thoughts fixed on Kate. He recalls how Kate worried about the medical bills and how he assured her he would work harder to provide for their family. When the day's labor comes to an end, fatigue overwhelms him, and the AI voice congratulates him on achieving a remarkable 370 revolutions. While resting, Joe notices the name Alex carved beneath the wooden handle of the stone mill and asks his neighbor about it. The neighbor reveals that Alex is the only person who managed to escape from this place. At that moment, Mallard rewards Joe for his day's work with an engraved pen. However, Joe's anger mounts when he receives the engraved pen as a reward, as it holds no practical value in his current situation. The following day, as the work begins, Joe is shocked to see that his daily quota has been increased to 370 revolutions. He protests, explaining that his injured hands prevent him from meeting this new target. The AI voice counters, suggesting that humans are more capable than they believe. Despite his reservations, Joe starts working, only to discover that he isn't earning a point for each revolution. Instead, his clock is marked with an X. When he questions this, his neighbor explains that he has been penalized, and he now needs to complete 2 revolutions to earn a single point, effectively doubling his daily quota to 740 revolutions. With no other option, Joe begins his grueling labor. He pushes himself to the brink of exhaustion, but eventually, he can't continue. At the end of the day, the AI voice informs him that he has failed to meet his quota and suggests that he may need a new motivation. To terrify Joe, Kate's profile appears on the screen, and the AI voice threatens to bring her to this place as well. Fearing for his wife's safety, Joe hastily promises to meet his target the next day, and the AI offers him a chance to prove his commitment. On the following day, Joe covers the mill handle with his coat to reduce the strain on his injured hand. He summons every ounce of strength to achieve the revolutions. At one point, exhaustion leads to hallucinations, and he sees a mocking version of himself ridiculing his loyalty to Mallard. Despite these distractions, Joe perseveres, meeting his quota just moments before the clock strikes 10. The penalty is finally lifted from his record, and he falls asleep beside the mill. In the early hours of the morning, Joe is awakened by the AI voice, which presents him with a short video of his wife in the hospital with their newborn child. Overwhelmed by a rush of emotions, Joe breaks down in tears, realizing that he has become a father but couldn't be there for his wife during this crucial moment. Joe, determined to escape this place and be reunited with his family, approaches the air vent once again to ask the neighbor about how Alex managed to get out. At first, the neighbor is hesitant to share this information, but upon learning about Joe's newborn baby and relating it to his own life, he decides to help. He directs Joe to a spot behind a pillar where the CCTV camera can't see. Following the instructions, Joe discovers a weak spot in the wall and uses his engraved pen to start digging. Over the passing days, Joe dedicates his free time to digging the hole in the wall. Eventually, he manages to create a hole large enough for him to crawl through. Venturing into this dark, unknown space, Joe hopes to find a way out. However, his efforts are in vain as the guard discovers him and incapacitates him. When Joe regains consciousness, he realizes that the hole has been filled in once more. As a punishment, his daily quota is increased to a staggering 1,000 revolutions, while his neighbor faces the horrific consequences of being left without a leg. Joe feels helpless and apologizes to his neighbor, but the pain is too much for the man to bear, rendering him unable to work any longer. Joe begins to wonder if there's anything he can do, but the neighbor explains that the entire facility is controlled by algorithms, and reasoning with AI is impossible. He reveals that he was the one who created the algorithm when he used to work in the IT department. Upon hearing this revelation, Joe has an epiphany. He realizes that if all the inmates stop working and earn 0 points, it will result in a tie, and the algorithm won't be able to single out and punish anyone. Fired up by this idea, Joe attempts to rally his fellow inmates into forming a union and persuading them not to work. As the work hours begin, the inmates appear to be persuaded by Joe's plan, and they refuse to work. However, when the AI voice announces that employees with 0 points will be terminated, fear of death prompts the cellmates to start working again, foiling Joe's initial plan. Seeing his efforts fail, the neighbor urges Joe to rotate the mill, assuring him not to worry about him. Left with no other choice, Joe manages to secure a revolution just moments before the work time expires, earning himself a point. Joe is overwhelmed with guilt and sympathy for his neighbor, Alex, who couldn't earn any points due to his injury. That night, the neighbor, who knows that his end is near, decides to make a confession to Joe. He reveals that he is, in fact, Alex, the one who tried to escape through the tunnel before but was captured by the guard. Much like Joe, he had been placed in a separate cell and chose not to disclose his identity to Joe, hoping that a second escape attempt would have a different outcome. After a heartfelt conversation, they bid each other farewell, knowing what lies ahead. As Joe tries to settle down for the night, he is haunted by the anguished cries of Alex as he is eliminated. The following day, the AI presents Joe with another video, featuring his wife and their now walking son. Realizing the precious time he has lost in this cell, Joe becomes infuriated and vents his anger at the company, insulting Mallard for taking everything away from him despite his 10 years of loyal service. Unfortunately, the AI deems his behavior unacceptable and orders an immediate destruction. A group of Mallard employees, accompanied by the guard, enter Joe's cell, preparing for a lethal injection. The guard takes the opportunity to make mean-spirited remarks about Joe's wife and son, pushing Joe over the edge. In a fit of rage, Joe attacks the guard and begins to brutally punch him. The AI intervenes, announcing that the guard has failed his task and that if Joe completes the guard elimination, he will be promoted to the next level. In response, Joe stops and vehemently declares that he is not a monster and won't allow the company to turn him into one. He quits. Suddenly, Joe regains consciousness and is shocked to find himself back in his office. It turns out that the entire ordeal was an advanced virtual simulation, with employees connected to a machine through head-mounted devices. Shortly after his experience in the virtual world, an HR representative, who bears a resemblance to the guard in the simulation, approaches Joe. The HR representative informs Joe that although he felt that months had passed, in reality, it had only been an hour. This revelation means that Joe's son has not been born yet, and everything is as it was before. However, the HR representative explains that Joe's performance in the virtual world exceeded their expectations, and they have decided to promote him to the next level. In the aftermath, the HR representative takes Joe to his new office cabin, where he is briefed on his new targets and productivity expectations. Joe is also required to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which prohibits him from sharing any details about his experience with anyone. After the HR representative leaves, Joe contacts his wife and is deeply moved upon hearing her voice. He expresses his love for her and their unborn child before ending the call. The movie concludes with Joe vowing to take action against the Mallard Company, determined to bring it down. If you are interested in such films, please proceed to the next video on the screen and also share your thoughts about this film in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. Goodbye.